And welcome to this week's edition of the Mutant Blitz Podcast. I'm your host, Josh Hennig. This week on the podcast, we're going to dive into the NFL season as we're 32 days from the start of the official league season with the defending Super Bowl champion Philadelphia Eagles hosting the Atlanta Falcons. We'll also touch on the news of who was cast officially for the CW's Batwoman character, why Baker Mayfield embodies the difficult transition from college to the NFL for many players. The new villain has been revealed for season 2 of Iron Fist on Netflix. The issue with recency bias when it comes to debating who the best players of all time. And I will give you my review of Cloak and Dagger season 1, which just finished up on Freeform. So let's open up that 6-pack and jump in to these topics. Topic number 1 on this week's edition of the Mutant Blitz Podcast. So with the NFL season just about 32 days away as I'm recording this on Wednesday night, August 8th, every football season, there's consistently 3 things without fail that happen every season. Every year, there are teams that didn't make the postseason the year before that are in the playoffs the next season. You know, last year it was the Eagles, it was the Jacksonville Jaguars, it was the Los Angeles Rams, the Minnesota Vikings. Also, every year, there's a handful of players who come out of nowhere to have successful seasons. Just look at Case Keenum and Kareem Hunt from last year. Also, every year, there's a team that surprises everyone and how successful they are. Last year, it was the Jacksonville Jaguars. But the one thing we never know each year is how are the defending Super Bowl champions going to perform the next season. Historically, just because you win a Super Bowl is never a guarantee of future success. Just even reaching the Super Bowl, many teams that have lost the year before, some of them don't even make the playoffs the next year. The Panthers lost to the Broncos a couple of years ago. Panthers won't make the playoffs next year at all. Look at the Falcons. They barely made it back in the postseason this year. Go further before that. When the Bears lost to the Colts in the Super Bowl, they didn't make the postseason next year. So making it to the Super Bowl isn't even a guarantee. But the defending Super Bowl champion always has the great risk that the success on the greatest stage in the postseason and the Super Bowl forces teams to have to make a decision. Who can they keep? Who can they get away with letting walk? And players leave teams every year. Now, some of them are more famous than others. For example, after the Broncos beat the Carolina Panthers back in Super Bowl 50, they lost several players to free agency, along with players on the defensive side as well, along with Danny Trevathan. Peyton Manning retired. So they lost some various parts of their team. You go back years before that. When the Ravens won the Super Bowl back in Super Bowl 47, you look at guys like Ray Lewis retiring. Yeah, we know about that, but Darnell Ellerbe left in free agency. You had a couple of the offensive linemen leave in free agency. And then there were injuries that piled up the next season for the Ravens, which hurt them. And ever since then, they've not been able to gain any traction in trying to get back to a Super Bowl. The New York Giants, both through Super Bowls they won, guys either retired or left in free agency. But every year, players leave the Super Bowl champions because either the team doesn't want to pay them the max dollar that they're asking for, or the team is willing to find a replacement elsewhere. So for the Philadelphia Eagles, the big question hanging over them is, can they get back to a Super Bowl for back-to-back seasons? But the Eagles are very different than the Broncos of Super Bowl 50, or the Ravens of Super Bowl 47, or the Giants Super Bowl 46. Eagles are a very different animal because the Eagles won their Super Bowl. It was much more about team than stars. The backup quarterback was the Super Bowl MVP. The Eagles invested a lot of resources, draft picks, and contracts into the offensive and defensive lines. This was not a team that was built around superstar wide receivers or running backs or cornerbacks or linebackers. You could argue the best player on the Philadelphia Eagles is a defensive lineman, Fletcher Cox. a very, very different set of circumstances compared to past Super Bowl teams. And then the players they did lose, you could argue they upgraded those positions. When they traded away Torrey Smith, they replaced it with Mike Wallace. Mike Wallace has better hands than Torrey Smith, probably a better route runner as well than Torrey Smith. They let Vinny Curry and Bo Allen walk. They replaced them with Michael Bennett and Haloti Ngata, two veteran forces of nature who are still effective and former Super Bowl champions themselves. LeGarrette Blount left in free agency, but you already had a deep running back position after acquiring Jay Ajayi before the trade deadline last year. Corey Clement, the undrafted free agent coming out of nowhere. So it's not like the Eagles lost that much in terms of talent from last year to this year. Even when a guy like Patrick Robinson, who was a surprise breakout player last year in the slot, the New Orleans Saints overpaid him to leave Philadelphia, to go back to New Orleans. So it wasn't as damning of a loss as it could have been otherwise. So going into 2018, you could argue that on paper, the 2018 Philadelphia Eagles are actually better than the 2017 team. Now, the big difference is you have a target on your back. You're the hunted, no longer the hunting. You are the team that everyone is gunning for. But also, the Eagles are a team now with a first-place schedule. And as a result, the Eagles have a more difficult schedule this year on paper again than they did last year. It's just the nature of the way the league works, how the scheduling gets done. And when you look at the Philadelphia Eagles, there are a lot of questions about Carson Wentz and Nick Foles, but the real question has actually nothing to do with that. The big question for the Eagles should be about depth, because anytime you win a Super Bowl, you lose guys. The question is how you replace them. I think bringing in Michael Bennett, Haloti Ngata, and Mike Wallace shows that the Eagles didn't want to make the same mistakes as the Broncos did, as the Ravens did, as the Giants did, as the Saints did, even as the Packers did years ago. They didn't want to make those mistakes again. And as a result, the Eagles are in a very good position because of the culture in that locker room, because of the type of leaders and veterans they have already on the roster, along with the additions they made this offseason, are in prime position to try to contend for another Super Bowl. Obviously, the 16 games have to still play out, but at least on paper, it's all we have right now. I think the Eagles are still one of the top dogs in the NFC. Now, the teams threatening them, the Vikings are going to be there again. They upgraded a quarterback. They added Sheldon Richardson to already deep defense on the defensive line. The Rams made major upgrades on their defense, adding Aqib Talib and Marcus Peters, replacing Sammy Watkins with Brandon Cooks. Rams are going to be there. To me, it's the Rams and the Vikings are the two teams that are the biggest threats to the Eagles. I know the Giants made improvements, but I don't really think the Giants are going to take the NFC East from the Eagles at this moment. I reserve the right to change my mind when I give my official preseason predictions later this month. But as of right now, to me, the best teams in the NFC are the Eagles, the Rams, and the Vikings. And I think that because those three teams put in so much of their time into improving their teams, I think that that is what's going to separate them from the other teams. I know the 49ers are a sexy pick right now because of Jimmy Garoppolo. I know that everyone's looking at Aaron Rodgers coming back from injury and the Packers having a new offensive and a new defensive coordinator. But at the end of the day, I think the Eagles still have to be in the conversation as one of the best teams in the NFC, and they did not succumb to the pitfalls of previous teams letting all kinds of guys walk and being unable to cover for the losses that they took. The Eagles have upgraded on the defensive line. They've upgraded at the wide receiver position. They are still deep at the cornerback position. So the Philadelphia Eagles are the defending Super Bowl champions, and don't expect a drop-off from last year to this year because the head coach and the players all still appear to be hungry and focused, and that's a negative for the rest of the NFC because if the Eagles can be as good or better than they were last year, there realistically is only a couple teams that have a chance to beat them at all. If any of those teams have to come to Philadelphia, the odds of beating them become even more difficult in the postseason. Topic number 2 on this week's edition of the Mutant Blitz Podcast. The CW has officially cast the role of Batwoman. It's going to be Ruby Rose who is going to play Kate Kane, also known as Batwoman. I'm not going to focus on any cultural or any of the stuff that I think a lot of the mainstream media is trying to turn this into. Instead, I'm going to emphasize again the issue presented to CW. And it's an issue that the CW addressed this week, but they did it in a very flippant, indirect way. You see, as we've documented here on the Mutant Blitz Podcast, the CW is not going to be able to sustain all of these superhero shows. Not because there's a lack of interest in superhero shows, but because the way they've handled some of these shows has not helped viewership. It has not helped build viewership, and it has actually lost them viewers or gained no traction altogether. Specifically, Supergirl dropping in ratings, the inconsistency, the unbalanced seasons for Supergirl has hurt the ratings as well. The massive changes over the last few years to DC Legends of Tomorrow has caused some people to fall off the wagon in terms of following that show. Right now, the highest rated show in the CW of all the superhero shows is The Flash. Second is Black Lightning. Third is The Arrow. Fourth is Supergirl. And fifth is DC Legends of Tomorrow. So now you're introducing a 6th show into the Rolodex for the CW on television. How is another superhero show going to work in an environment where superheroes are popular? It is a trendy thing to do, but on the CW, we know that because a lot of people are cutting the cord, because a lot of people are not watching as much linear television as they used to, the question becomes, what is the long-term sustainability for the CW with all of these shows? The CW can say all they want. They have no plans of ending any of their shows. But Stephen Amell did come out and say that before this season, he asked the writers to treat this season as if it could be their last. I don't think Amell says that for no good reason. I think Stephen Amell knows that going into his 7th season on a show that when it was first started, nobody knew if it could be successful. You know, taking a character of Oliver Queen, the Green Arrow, a character that made appearances on a show like Smallville, a character that made appearances on the Justice League animated television series for kids about 18 years ago. He wasn't a mainstream character. It wasn't even a B-level character. The Arrow has always been about a C-level, C-plus level character. So for them to evolve that show into an entire universe on a television network that is not CBS, NBC, or Fox is in and of itself a big deal. But even then, it's the 3rd highest rated show of all the major superhero shows on the CW. So the question is, can the CW not make the mistakes that were made with season 1 of Arrow, that were made over the last couple of years with Supergirl, the mistakes that were made with other shows that have been on other networks? For example, Gotham got way out of hand and out of control in their storytelling and the evolution of the show and the characters. I mentioned Supergirl. Supergirl was marketed as a show for women, about women who are playing heroes, but in many ways has proven that it's really not for women, that it has concepts that may appeal, that may have an appeal for a female viewership, but at the end of the day, it's just another superhero. She just happens to be a woman. So aesthetically, you're not appealing to women. Writing-wise, you're not really appealing to women. I would say that the Arrow has and the Flash have more of a female viewership appeal than the Supergirl even does. And then with this first, I mentioned the first season of Arrow, what the mistake they make is they drew out the origin story of Oliver Queen becoming the Arrow so much in season 1 that it took people to have to believe in the show and invest in the show all the way through the first season. to get the payoff. That was a problem. Now, we've already seen the CW has avoided the pitfalls of other shows with a show like Black Lightning. And Black Lightning, similar to Batwoman, is a character that is not as famous, not as popular as the other super characters like The Flash and Supergirl. So they have a chance to make their own mark, do a story the way they want to do it, not worry about the ancillary concerned about, well, this is the Superman we know, this is the Batman we know, this is the whatever character we know and we've experienced. It's kind of a fresh slate when it comes to Batwoman. Now, Ruby Rose is really the first time that we've had someone cast for one of these CW shows who actually is a known actress from the action world. She has played in movies such as John Wick 2, Triple X: Return of Xander Cage. She's also going to be in the upcoming Jason Statham film, The Meg. So she is known as a woman who is already a certain type of character, certain type of personality. When the CW cast Stephen Amell as the Arrow or Grant Gustin as the Flash, it wasn't like those people were known to be able to play this kind of role. Whereas Ruby Rose, you see her at this point as a alpha female on the big screen. It's more believable, for at least in the promotion sense, that she can be Kate Kane, aka Batwoman. So this is another step forward for the CW. And now with the addition, you're going to have, after the crossover event in December, 6 CW superhero shows. The Flash, The Arrow, Black Lightning, Supergirl, Legends of Tomorrow, and Batwoman. And to me, the CW can tell us all they want. They have no plans of canceling any of these shows. But at the end of the day, if Supergirl again struggles in the ratings, if The Arrow takes a dip in their ratings, or if Legends of Tomorrow is not able to capitalize on the addition of John Constantine to their show, then the CW is going to have strong conversations about, is it worth their time to have 6 comic book based shows all on the same network? And it doesn't matter to me that who's writing or directing or involved in the show. Look, Greg Berlanti's been involved in a lot of shows. He hasn't gotten them all right. He's got a lot of right, but he has not gotten them all right. I know Jeff Johns is going to be involved with the writing and the executive producing of the show. Jeff Johns is, remember, the guy who stepped down from DC Entertainment, the movie extension of the DC universe, because some of his ideas and plans did not work out on the big screen. Can he learn from those mistakes in his involvement on the small screen? Also, the show is going to be written by Carolyn Dries. She is the writer of The Vampire Diaries. The Vampire Diaries, a very different show than telling a superhero story. Because one of the important things about having a quality, good superhero show is to have that balance between action and storytelling that doesn't outweigh one or the other. You don't want too much action. You don't want too much storytelling, because the viewer is tuning in for certain things. They want to see certain types of activities, certain types of action, but they also want a certain amount of substance and character building from their show. So it doesn't matter how much of a badass Ruby Rose is historically in her different roles. What matters is that is the Batwoman we're given going to live up to the expectations? And you could argue in some ways Supergirl has not lived up to the expectations for her show, despite the show being able to stay on the air. You have to wonder, can Batwoman avoid making the same mistakes that the other shows have already on the CW? Topic number 3 on this week's edition of the Mutant Blitz Podcast. For the HBO's Hard Knocks this year, which is for those who don't know, it is the yearly behind-the-scenes show that HBO does of a different NFL team during each preseason. This year we have the the Cleveland Browns, coming off of a winless season in 2017. They had the number 1 overall pick. They drafted Baker Mayfield, a bit of a controversial draft pick to some people. And what we saw just in the first episode of Hard Knocks is the embodiment of the difficulty it is for any athlete. It doesn't matter how talented you are, it doesn't matter what university you went to make the transition from the college game to the NFL game. Take a listen to this interaction between Browns head coach Hugh Jackson, who walks over in this cut to Baker Mayfield and puts his arms around him. And when he talks to him, Baker Mayfield, number 1 overall pick, Heisman Trophy winner. Here's what Baker had to say when Hugh Jackson asked him the following questions.
What's up, my son?
So I guess that's what you said when you said it was different.
I tried to tell you. And what time do you normally get up in the mornings?
I was a little bit later this morning.
No, I know. But what time do you normally come over?
Depends on when we start.
Huh?
Try and get in about 2 hours before.
Okay. Do you ever come in with your boy 5?
He does his own little workouts in the mornings.
Where's your own little workout in the morning?
Huh?
Where's your own little workout in the morning? You start starting your career how you want to. You see what I'm saying? It's a competition in everything you do, baby.
A couple major takeaways from that cut. First of all, give Hugh Jackson a lot of credit for going out of his way to try to explain life in the NFL to Baker Mayfield. And that's the fact that he asked him, are you coming in and working out with 5? 5 is the current starting quarterback, Tyrod Taylor. Tyrod Taylor, who started on a playoff team last season with the Buffalo Bills. And earlier in that episode, we saw that Tyrod gets there around 5 a.m. each morning. And Hugh Jackson, the head coach, turns to Baker and says, well, where's your little workout? Baker has no answer for him. Baker said earlier in the cut, you heard him say, you were right when he said it's a lot different. You know, the environment, the crowd chanting his name in the background. And Hugh's trying to tell him, look, man, how you do your career, how you handle your business up to you, but everything's a competition. And I think that Baker is going through the same difficulty that a lot of young athletes go through when they make that transition from the college to the pros. One of the things that gets overlooked so much in sports is the fact that the reason why so many of these players are what we call busts. They never live up to the expectation of where they're drafted. They don't live up to the expectation of how they played in college. They can't transition their game from college to the NFL, is embodied in what you just heard from Baker Mayfield. 1, he didn't understand how different the pro game was. He didn't understand how much of a larger magnitude, how much bigger it was, how much more was going on at this level. The second thing is that Baker, his thinking is, well, I get here 2 hours early. That's good enough. It's not about how early you get to the facility. It's about the work that you put in when you get to the facility each day. And that's the huge difference between college and the NFL. Because in college, these athletes are asked to go to class, to keep their GPA at a certain level, especially if you're a football player, especially if you're a baseball player, or any of these sports where you're going to college for more than a couple of years. You're not one and done like the NBA. So for a football player, your focus is split in a few different directions. You got college life with going to class, your dorm room, your dorm mates, the lifestyle that comes along with college, and a lot of things are structured for you in college. You know, practice is at this time. You got to go to class before then. Your day is pretty much set for you, so you don't have a lot of flexibility. You don't have a lot of maneuverability within that substructure of your day. At the professional level, you got a lot more freedom with your time because you can show up an hour before, 2 hours before, 3 hours before. There's no right or wrong answer when it comes to how early or how late you stay. It all depends on what you're doing that day. And for a quarterback, it's a bigger deal for them to put in the extra work because the extra work is what differentiates them. And you're already seeing that a veteran quarterback like Tyrod Taylor, a guy who, let's be realistic, Tyrod Taylor is not a top 10 quarterback in the league. He's not even a top 12, 13, 14 quarterback in the league. I'd argue Tyrod Taylor is probably the 16, 17, 18, or 19th best quarterback in the NFL. So he's not even the top half of the league. But even he is showing up at 5 a.m. Even he is putting in long hours of work of training and video study and working through the playbook and trying to get his craft right. And that's a dude who's not even among the elite at his position. So for Baker Mayfield, he's learning that the structure is not there for him to just go through the motions when it comes to work and time and hours. It is on him to put in the extra work to be as great as he can be. And if Tyrod Taylor is outworking him and Tyrod Taylor doesn't have the skills and the abilities that Baker Mayfield does, what's the old saying? Hard work beats talent every time talent doesn't work hard. Well, guess what? If Tyrod Taylor, he may not have as strong of an arm as Baker Mayfield. He may not be as gifted physically in certain areas. He may not have been a first overall pick, Tyrod Taylor, but Tyrod Taylor is putting in the work to be a starter in the NFL at age 29. He has shown the ability to be efficient in the NFL. Taylor has shown you that he is not going to put his team in a position to lose games. He's going to put you in a position to win games. Tyrod Taylor, over the last 2 seasons, has had less than 10 interceptions each year. What does that tell you? That tells you that the guy is not going to make a mistake. And if Baker Mayfield wants to be the starter of the Cleveland Browns this year or next year, he's got to put in the time and the work to show that he is worthy of that starting job. Look at Sam Darnold. Sam Darnold missed the first couple of days of training camp because there was a contract negotiation issue between his agents and the Jets. So what did the players do? When he finally comes in, they mockingly clap like, oh, good, you finally showed up for training camp. The players don't hate him for it, but the players also understand that, look, we're going to judge you on what you do here. We don't care about your contract. We don't care about where you were drafted. Players respect work ethic. They respect the effort that you put in to the game itself. And for guys like Darnold and Mayfield and Lamar Jackson and Josh Rosen and Josh Allen, even a Mason Rudolph, all of these young quarterbacks coming into the league as rookies, what's going to differentiate them from the busts is going to be the time and the work they put into their craft. It is not good enough to be a first-round pick. It is not good enough to come from a big-time school like at Oklahoma, an Ohio State, a Virginia Tech. It is not good enough to have a strong arm. It's not good enough to be athletic. It's what you do with all of those gifts and those abilities and those accolades. Can you translate that into success on the football field? There's a reason why guys like Tom Brady and Russell Wilson and Joe Montana have championships. It's because for those guys, they had a chip on their shoulder. They had to work extra hard. They were not first-round picks. They were not highly touted prospects coming out of college. They were good prospects, but they weren't the best of the best in their class. For Baker Mayfield and these other highly touted prospects, they have to learn on the job quickly that it's not enough to say, well, I came here 2 hours early. It's what are you doing when you are showing up 2 hours early? What is your workout regimen? What is your program? What is your plan to go and be a success? And for Baker Mayfield, we're going to find out very quickly, not just on this Hard Knocks television show, which is going to run for the next several weeks on HBO, but we're also going to learn throughout the season, how does he handle all of this stuff? Does he keep grinding or does he coast through? Look at a guy like Carson Wentz. Carson Wentz has literally been told by his girlfriend, who is now his wife, at the time was still his girlfriend, honey, put down the video, stop studying game tape. I want you here with me. We're out to dinner. Stop studying game tape. That's who Carson Wentz is. Carson Wentz spends an inordinate amount of time studying to get better. improving his craft, improving his knowledge of the playbook, improving his knowledge of the league as a whole. That's what made him into the quarterback that he is. The time, the work is what makes Tom Brady, Aaron Rodgers, all the best quarterbacks who they are. If Mayfield, Rosen, Darnold, Allen, and Jackson want to be great, then they're going to have to put the work in. It's not the amount of time you put in, it's what are you doing with your time. Remember, again, hard work beats talent every time. Talent doesn't work hard. Topic number 4 on this week's edition of the Mutant Blitz Podcast. So with the second season of Iron Fist coming out this September on Netflix, the official villain is going to be Typhoid Mary Walker. A very interesting character to introduce into the Netflix universe. Another more grounded type villain for the characters to deal with. And I like the fact they're bringing Mary, Typhoid Mary, into this show for 2 reasons. One, because it shows that they're serious about taking a different twist on the Iron Fist character and on the development of Danny Rand as basically being a character who's learning how to live in a world that is different than he experienced for over a decade. Remember, when he spent over a decade training to be the Iron Fist, he wasn't living in New York. He wasn't dealing with city life, with business responsibilities. He was living in the mountains, walking around barefoot. It was a totally different lifestyle for him. So now that he's gone through coming back to New York City, taking over his company, learning who the other defenders are, watching what he assumed to be Matt Murdock's death, promising him that he would protect the city of New York. Now he's dealing with a very formidable villain in Typhoid Mary. So, for those who don't know, Typhoid Mary has 2 specific abilities. She has psionic-based powers such as telekinesis, and she suffers from dissociative identity disorder. She has 3 specific abnormal personalities. Mary is this quiet pacifist, a very nice girl. The second personality being what is known as Typhoid, which is described by many as being very sexually aggressive, very violently aggressive. And the third personality known as Bloody Mary is basically a sadist. So you never know which version of your Mary you're getting from minute to minute. She could change personalities that quickly. But what makes her such a formidable villain is, aside from her psionic abilities of telekinesis, she is also very formidable in hand-to-hand combat. She knows how to use blades in combat. And each of those personalities still comes from the same person. So she could have a goal in mind all along, but each personality has a different take on her said goal. So let's say if her goal was to assassinate someone. Well, each of those personalities has a different take on how to accomplish that goal, and the personalities typically find a way to work together to accomplish that goal. And aside from her abilities of telekinesis, hand-to-hand combat, ability to use weapons, and her personalities which drive her ability to get the job done, it's the unpredictability that makes her such a formidable villain as well. Alice Eve, who has been cast to play the role of Typhoid Mary on the Iron Fist Netflix show, to me is the perfect casting role for this character, because she's an actress who can play a multitude of different character types, and she's shown that throughout her career, and now she gets to express that all in one show, because with Typhoid Mary having 3 specific different personalities, Alice Eve gets to portray her ability to play different characters in different ways, in different fashions. And she's also an actress who has a certain look to her that allows you to believe each of those personality traits when she portrays them on the screen. So I'm definitely looking forward to her character being on the Iron Fist show, especially with the evolution of the show, moving away from some of the mistakes that were made in season 1 to helping evolve Danny Rand's character in season 2. And I think that the evolution of his character is going to be very helpful in developing the Netflix universe, because for characters like Daredevil, Luke Cage, and the Punisher, those are three characters who have distinct origins, have distinct storylines, and have a distinct specific audience. But for characters like Jessica Jones and Iron Fist, you're dealing with characters that have a little bit less depth to their history in comics. There's a little bit more creative licensing that goes into these characters when it comes to the depth of who the characters are personality-wise. So allowing the characters to maybe grow a little bit, evolve a little bit, and flesh out different details of the character development with the Netflix show is going to be an interesting deal with a villain who, for all intents and purposes, may be one of the most complicated villains to portray on any superhero television show, let alone a Netflix show that allows you the freedom that you may not have on a network television show or even a premium cable network, because every network still has their things they want and don't want done on their television shows, whereas Netflix allows you to go to the full extent of the character with a Typhoid Mary, with a Danny Rand, with a Colleen Wing. And I think it's going to be a lot of fun to watch when this show comes around in September to see how far they really can take the character development for this season. Topic number 5 on this week's edition of the Mutant Blitz Podcast has to touch on the aftermath of this past weekend's Pro Football Hall of Fame inductions. First of all, congratulations again goes out to Brian Dawkins, Ray Lewis, Randy Moss, Terrell Owens, Bobby Beathard, Donald Brazil, Andrea Kramer for all being honored this weekend in Canton. What comes out of a lot of these Hall of Fame inductions is what I like to refer to as the objective versus subjective arguments that go on about who's the greatest of all time, who's the best at their position, which player was better than another, which player excelled more than the other, who's overrated, who's underrated, all these different kinds of discussions. And I find it interesting how people take such strong positions. And what happens is because there are two specific problems that happen with these conversations. I've been having a discussion this week with my co-host from Hanging with Hendricks and Hennig on 97.3 ESPN, Monday nights from 6 to 8 p.m., Deshaun Hendricks, about where Chris Carter is in relation to Terrell Owens and Randy Moss among the greatest wide receivers. I've had numerous conversations in the last couple of weeks about who's the better middle linebacker, Ray Lewis or Brian Urlacher. I've also, this is on the heels of having numerous conversations who's the greatest player in NBA history in the last few months because of what LeBron has done this past season. And it all comes back to there's two perspectives that come out in every conversation that I end up having, whether it's on the radio, at the gym, or anywhere I go, which is there are people who think they're being objective. But instead of being objective, what they're doing is they're coming at the conversation blinded by one of two things: recency bias or favoritism. And here's how both of those disrupt the entire debate. And while the debate should be fun, it should be interesting, it should be something that is, people can take sides and agree to disagree. But where the conversation is not productive and causes a lot of people to have these intense emotions has to do with one of those two biases. Let's deal with recency bias first. So often people become obsessed with who is the greatest of all time, whether it's among all players, whether it's at a position, whatever it is. And while it's a fun conversation, recency bias is something that tends to only happen when it comes to sports. It never comes up in music or politics or any of the other types of debatable issues out there. And the reason why recency bias is so intense in terms of sports is because fandom causes people to take sides because the most recent thing they've seen is the freshest thing in their minds. So as a result, there's an attitude very often that the greatest team or the greatest player right now is the best team or the best player that they've ever seen. They quickly forget what they saw 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. Because what happens is that it's not fresh in their mind anymore. They don't remember as intently watching those players play, watching those other players or other teams have the success that they did. So what happens? When the Seattle Seahawks and the Denver Broncos win their Super Bowls, people say, well, these got to be two of the greatest defenses of all time. And it doesn't matter if you bring up the 2000 Ravens, the 85 Bears, the Philadelphia Eagle teams of the late 80s and early 90s, the Steelers of the 1970s. Whatever team you want to use, more often than not, people say, oh, well, you don't understand. So-and-so is a better athlete today, or these athletes are better today than they were. They're bigger, they're stronger, they're faster. And I hate that argument because, one, if you gave the athletes of the 70s, 80s, and 90s today's workout regimens, today's medicine, today's nutritionists, all of the benefits of playing sports in today's world, you gave them all of those resources, you don't think that the great players of yesterday would be successful today? That is an intensely neglectful and ignorant perspective to have. The other problem with recency bias is that what it does is it assumes that the best players today would also be successful yesterday. You know, when we get into conversations about who are the greatest fighters of all time, if you go to MMA or to boxing, what happens is that people are so hyper-focused on one aspect of an athlete's skill set, speed, power, whatever it may be that they want to focus on, they use that and they so intently, microscopically zero in on that. The assumption is that, well, Mike Tyson is great because he had knockout power in his prime. Or the assumption is Floyd Mayweather is so great because look at his defensive boxing, look at his speed. Or in MMA, what's one of the conversations that is had about John Jones? The most phenomenal, unstoppable athlete I've ever seen in the octagon. Well, all of these biases, what they do is that they paint this picture that you're basically setting up the argument that no matter what the other person says, no matter what the other discussion is being had, your opinion is the only opinion that matters because of this. So what people do very often is they set the conversation up in a way that you actually can't have a back and forth debate because they've already set a foundation of look at his speed, look at his defense, look how great he is. Instead of saying, let's have a conversation about what makes each athlete great from each era. So what recency bias does is it doesn't factor in the eras. It doesn't factor in each athlete's dominance. All it says is the best thing I've seen is the most recent thing I've seen. The other side of that is wrong about these debates in the objective versus the subjective, where most people think they're being objective, but they're actually being subjective, is favoritism. We all had the athletes we grew up and we liked, right? You know, if you're somebody who grew up in the Philadelphia area, you may have been a huge fan of Allen Iverson. So as a result, you see other players who played in his era maybe as less than him. Because what did you see every game day? You saw Allen Iverson play. You didn't see the other players around the league play as much. So you may have a favoritism lean toward Iverson. So if someone says, well, who are the greatest scoring guards of all time? Certain people may jump up and say, well, it's Allen Iverson. Let me tell you about Allen Iverson. But someone else who maybe grew up in another part of the country may say, well, hold on a minute. If I'm from LA, and let me tell you something, I got to see Kobe Bryant every day for almost 20 years. You go to someone who maybe is from another part of the country, and you ask them about who the greatest scoring shooting guard of all time. Someone may turn around and say, you know, look, you didn't see Tracy McGrady during his time in Orlando and Houston. You're forgetting about him. And what happens? The conversation keeps going back and forth, not based on each player's ability, but because that person's favorite athlete they saw every day was who they had the jersey of, who they had the poster on the wall, who they emulated on the basketball court. And I thought it was very interesting that Kareem Abdul-Jabbar was asked about who the greatest of all time is by Mark Spears of ESPN's The Undefeated. And Kareem, all-time scoring leader in NBA history, 6-time NBA champion, multiple-time MVP, he said that there is actually no such thing as the greatest of all time. Yes, Kareem is saying that. But there's a reason why. He said, the reason there is no such thing as the greatest of all time is because every player plays under unique circumstances. We've played different positions, under different rules, with different teammates, with different coaches. Kareem goes on to say, every player has to adapt to their circumstances and find a way to excel. This isn't Highlander. There can be more than one. So when we're having this conversation and people start picking their favorites, what happens? They insist that their guy has to be better than someone else's. So when you have a guy who is one of the greatest of all time, look who Kareem played with. He played with Oscar Robertson. He played with Magic Johnson, James Worthy. He played with some of the greatest players ever played this game. He himself being arguably, if not one of the greatest, possibly the greatest of all time, himself. And he's saying there doesn't have to be just one greatest of all time. Fascinating concept. Because in favoritism, what happens? The Iverson fan, the Kobe fan, the Tracy McGrady fan sticks their flag in the ground and says, it doesn't matter what you think, I'm telling you that my guy is the greatest. So then what happens? Like the conversations I've had about wide receivers. Someone may be a fan of Terrell Owens, and they forget about what happened with Chris Carter's career. That Chris Carter played with lesser quarterbacks and still put up gaudy numbers. That T.O. played with better quarterbacks and put up gaudy numbers. So is it the wide receiver that's great, or did he happen to play with great quarterbacks who put him in position to be great? Those are two very different things. You don't have to put down another player to make your case. But what happens is that people only see the players they like through the filter that they have already put forth. So then what happens? It doesn't matter what you say. That person who's a fan of Terrell Owens likes Terrell Owens more than Chris Carter. And what people do is they say, well, I don't remember Chris Carter. To which I always say, well, go back and watch him. You see, no one ever says, well, Chris Brown is a better pop and R&B musician than Michael Jackson, because I never saw Michael Jackson. That was before I was born. No one in their right mind is going to say that about music. Or with presidents. If you meet someone who tells you, well, George W. Bush is a better president than Abraham Lincoln because I wasn't alive when Abraham Lincoln was around, and we've gotten better since the 1860s, so automatically George W. Bush is better because we're better today than we were back then. These opinions are not based on history. They're not based on an objective perspective of all parties involved in the argument. They're based on either, well, this is the guy I like, so no matter what you say, you're wrong. Or the argument is, well, that was before my time, and the best we've ever had is right now, so automatically these guys are better. Both arguments are flawed and very, very limited in scope, because what happens is people start saying, well, you're an idiot, or you're ridiculous, or you're insane. Why? Because I have a difference of opinion, and I'm taking the information that I have gathered, hours and hours of watching film, hours and hours of pouring through information involved in the argument. Because I'll admit it, I'm a sports geek. This is what I'm passionate about. This is what I'm interested in. I will sit there and research video, research stats, go through information. I'm not going through this stuff because I think I'm better than somebody else. This is what I'm passionate about. So as a result, you turn around and you see people They can recite to you all the plays that their favorite player did. Let me tell you what Randy Moss did. Let me tell you this great story about Randy Moss, the player he was, the athlete he was. And then when you bring up a point to them that most people have also brought up, they say, well, that idea is wrong and here's why. Instead of hearing out the argument, instead of working through the argument and saying, well, I understand what you're saying, but let me give you an example why that is wrong. And then saying, I understand that Randy Moss in Oakland at times quit on his team. That Randy Moss at the end of his Patriots tenure basically forced the Patriots' hand to get rid of him because he was turning out to be a problem for the team. Or that he wore out his welcome in Minnesota and in Tennessee. That he had to take a year off from the NFL because people didn't know if he was serious about playing football anymore. There were all these variables within Randy Moss's career, but because someone can tell you that Randy Moss played with a torn hamstring, that automatically erases all the opinions of what happened with him in Oakland and at the end of his 10 years in New England, Tennessee, and Minnesota. We can't get so caught up in our favoritism and our recency bias that we forget about history. Just because someone is great today doesn't lessen the athlete's accomplishments from the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. Just because Albert Pujols and Mike Trout are great today doesn't mean that Babe Ruth and Ted Williams were less of hitters because they played almost a century ago. Just because the athletes are bigger, stronger, and faster today in the NFL doesn't mean that Walter Payton and Jim Brown were less athletes and lesser running backs because they played 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago. Just because the speed of the game aesthetically looks faster and more athletic and more involved than it did in the 80s and the 90s doesn't mean that Michael Jordan and Scottie Pippen and Dominique Wilkins were lesser athletes than the guys are today. And that's why I like what Kareem Abdul-Jabbar said. This isn't Highlander. There can be more than one greatest of all time. I think it's a more fair conversation to say, who are your top 5, who are your top 10, than to just single out 1 or 2 or 3 people and eliminate everybody else from conversation. Because at the end of the day, if you're to go purely based on stats, you're going to be limited in your ability to have a productive conversation. If you're going to go purely on who your favorite player is, again, another limitation on the conversation. If you're going to have recency bias, another limitation on the conversation. You cannot stay focused on one aspect of a player when you're having these kind of debates, because it goes from being a fun and interesting conversation to people taking things personal. And when it becomes personal, it's not a fun conversation anymore. And sports is meant to be fun. It's supposed to be an outlet, the way to get away from things. But instead, many times, people are turning sports like it's political conversation. Like, you're on the right, I'm on the left, and we can't meet in the middle. This isn't politics. This isn't dealing with life and death issues. This is sports. So let's enjoy it and stop taking it personal and be honest and open about the players that we're talking about. Topic number 6 on this week's edition of the Mutant Blitz Podcast. So the first season of Cloak and Dagger is done. I finally finished watching it this past weekend. And I have to say I'm pleasantly surprised with the show. Just to give a little background, I went into this show very skeptical and not expecting to actually enjoy it, because the Cloak and Dagger from the comics are 2 characters that the history of the characters is just really loose and fast and mediocre in how it's set up. It's very hyper stereotypical, and realistically the characters are more anti-heroes than superheroes in the comics. It's not until later that Cloak and Dagger are evolved into more reliable characters that have a little more substance and a little less ridiculousness around them. So when they announced they were coming out with this show, I was very, 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 very skeptical. I think the thing that made me enjoy the show the most is that they genuinely retconned these characters. This is not the Cloak and Dagger from the comics. This is a retelling of these characters. And this retelling and this revision of the characters in multiple aspects has been what has made the show a success. Cloak and Dagger has had a very strong audience all summer. The summer is the time of year where it's very hard to get good television ratings. And the show averaged about 4.4 million viewers across all platforms this season. So it had a steady, strong audience from adults 18 to 49. Also, it is the highest ever debut in the male viewer demographic for the Freeform network. It's also been the network's #1 summer show and the #1 summer show among women 18 to 34 and the 12 to 34 demographics. So men are watching the show, women are watching the show, and it's in the middle of summer. People don't watch a lot of television shows. So to get those kind of numbers only proves that Marvel's got a good thing here, which is why the show has been renewed for 2019. Now let's get into the nitty-gritty. Spoiler warning, if you haven't seen the show, I'm going to give away details of the show now. So if you don't want to hear about it, you can jump ahead to the end of the podcast. What makes the story great is also what is different from the comics. So the story is set in the New Orleans area. It is not set in the New York City area like it is in the comics. Tyrone, who becomes Cloak, is a young man whose brother was killed, and he gains these powers the day his brother was murdered. On the inverse, Dagger, who is played by Tandy, she gained her powers the day her father died in the same incident. So the way they rewrite it is there's an explosion. The wave from the explosion hits Tandy, hits Tyrone, and they gain these powers. Tyrone basically can teleport to different places, and when he touches people, he can see their greatest fears, along with his ability, which was shown in the very last 2 episodes, to absorb the darkness and send people to another reality inside of himself. He's basically a portal in some ways. And the way they explain that is the entity that is released on the world in this episode is dark matter. And that's what the company Roxxon is drilling for. They wanted to tap in to dark matter energy. Dark matter energy was something that was introduced during Marvel's Agent Carter Season 2 and also was elaborated on in Marvel's Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. Dark matter is also something that is touched on in movies like Thor and Doctor Strange. But the idea is that the dark matter has different effects on people in different environments. But typically what dark matter does is it drives people nuts. It brings out the worst in them, and it causes them to basically be thirsty to just be destructive to other people. Now, Dagger's abilities that she gained from the dark matter explosion is that she can create light constructs, and these constructs come out as daggers. She can use them to cut or stab people, or she can use them to eliminate the darkness that is absorbed in the evil in people. Also, when she touches people, she sees their greatest hopes and dreams, their greatest memories. So these abilities have a lot to do with the effects of dark matter on people. And the ironic thing is that the darkness that Cloak can tap into, Cloak doesn't come from very bad circumstances. He comes from a stable, traditional nucleus family, a married parents. Yeah, his brother was killed, but he goes to a nice school. Tandy, on the other hand, even though she can tap into hope and she is a light in darkness for a lot of people, she comes from a family where her father was murdered. Her mother is an on-again, off-again drug addict. She has basically been on-again, off-again homeless by her own choice, and she learned how to be a very good thief. So you have all these circumstances that go into these characters. There's a lot of depth behind them. They basically have to, throughout this first season, learn about how to handle their powers, how to use their powers, why they have their powers, how they can use their powers for good versus evil. And it's kind of a story that is a nice twist on what went into years ago the show Smallville. And the reason why I bring up Smallville is because Smallville specifically was a show that emphasized an aspect of storytelling when it came to superheroes that really had never been touched on before. When you go back and watch Smallville, you realize that the show isn't as much about Superman as much as it is about Clark Kent. And it's Clark Kent learning how to deal with his powers, how he gets new powers, how he learns that he's from Krypton. He learns who his real father was. He's dealing with all the ramifications and the side effects that go along with becoming an adult who is not like everybody else. And that similar discovery and growth and development and coming of age is being applied to this Cloak and Dagger show. Now, unlike Smallville, Cloak and Dagger is being a show that does allow you to feel like you're watching a superhero show. One of the problems with Smallville was that at times it felt more like a teenage drama that happened to have a guy with superpowers in it. Cloak and Dagger are two teenagers who are learning how to live with being superpowers, who are reluctant superheroes. So it's a different twist, but a similar concept. The biggest difference, though, between Smallville, which was 16 years ago, to Cloak and Dagger now, is that Cloak and Dagger is able to do what a lot of these types of shows have failed at in the past. And that is, Cloak and Dagger said, look, we know who our audience is, we know how to appeal to them, and we know what people want to hear, we know what people want to see, and we already have this universe we've built. When shows like Smallville came out, when Arrow came out, when Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. came out on television, or even the Flash television show from the 1990s, or the different animated Marvel and DC shows that came out in the 90s and early 2000s, a lot of these shows were not involved in a greater, larger universe. They were basically starting from scratch. Cloak and Dagger have the luxury of building on a well-known entity. They're implementing in dark matter, something that's been brought up on multiple other Marvel shows. They're part of a larger cinematic universe that asks questions. Well, are they inhuman? Are they mutant? Are their powers a mutation? Are their powers a genetic manipulation? Do their powers have an expiration date? You don't have all these questions if you didn't already have the other shows that came before Cloak and Dagger. Also, because Cloak and Dagger, for all intents and purposes, are D-level characters. Like, they are legit the characters that for so long in comics, there were so many people who just didn't give a damn about. Whenever Cloak and Dagger showed up in Spider-Man comics or in other comics, you were just like, oh, great, here are these idiots again. Why are they here? Why do we care about these losers? They evolved from that in the 80s and 90s to a television show where you can legitimately say, I want to see what's going to happen today with Cloak and Dagger. You know, what is going on with Tyrone? What is going on with Tanny? You become invested in these characters in a way that you never could in the comics. And that's it. That's the impressive thing what Marvel has done overall. They've taken characters like Cloak and Dagger. They've taken Iron Man. They've taken Iron Fist. They've taken Jessica Jones. They've taken these characters that are part of their extended universe and made them relatable, have made them interesting. They've turned them into characters that you want to see what happens next with them. And that's great writing. That is great instruction. That is what makes this such a fun show. And I think part of the reason why it appeals so much to younger people isn't just because Tyrone and Tanny are high school kids in the show, but because also their problems are millennial problems. The social media world, it's the technology, it's white versus black. There's a racial element involved in the show. There's a class warfare element involved in the show. So many different cultural aspects are dealt with in the show that it becomes more and more applicable to something that people can identify with. And many times, the failure of shows is that the show does not have a cross appeal to multiple types of people watching. There are shows that become so male dominant or so female dominant or so young people versus old people dominant that the show hurts not just in the ratings, but its inability to gain momentum. Because look at a show like Supergirl. I always criticize Supergirl because it claimed to be one thing from the beginning, and it got so far away from the original intention of the show that that's one of the reasons why it lost momentum. It has lost an audience. And now, going in the next season of Supergirl, it's having to try to evolve into a different show now. Cloak and Dagger doesn't have that problem because from the very first season, they found a way to appeal to males, appeal to females, appeal to people who are 18, appeal to people who are 34. I mean, when you're getting about 4.4 million viewers among adults 18 to 49, what you're doing is you're saying we're creating something that everybody wants to watch. And that is the value what Marvel has done. And I have to give a thorough thumbs up to Cloak and Dagger for putting on a very good show with an interesting storyline. Yeah, it wasn't perfect. It had its flaws. I think that they left you hanging a little bit too much with the connection between Detective O'Reilly and Misty Knight from the Netflix universe. I think that one of my problems with a lot of these shows is that when incidents happen, that you don't see anybody else ever show up. One of my beefs with Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., Cloak and Dagger, and some of these other shows is that how do all these crazy things happen and nobody ever shows up? Captain America never shows up, right? Ant-Man, Falcon, Black Widow, Nick Fury. Randomly, these people never just happen to be in the neighborhood, never happen to see on the news. What's going on down there? We should go and look into that. No, it's like everybody is so distant from each other. You're in a universe with hundreds of heroes and powered characters, good and evil, and yet they never cross over. It just doesn't seem very likely. Like, how do all these superheroes on the Netflix shows all be in New York and they never run into Spider-Man, or Spider-Man doesn't run into them? It seems very, very convenient that they never run into each other. To me, I think the next step for Cloak and Dagger is, all right, good show, we know you're there, but how do you factor in to the rest of the Marvel Universe? I'm not saying I need Wolverine on a show. I'm just saying it would make sense if War Machine was sent to investigate the Roxxon explosion and the fear terror that was running around New Orleans. It would make sense that the government sent somebody to check it out. Anybody to see what happened here. Why did this happen? You know, my name is so-and-so. Good to meet you, kids. How about you stop touching me and getting into my head? And like, you could have all these conversations and all these interactions. And I think that should be the next step for Marvel is they got to keep the crossover, cross-promotion, because it allows these shows and these characters to gain even more depth, to even bigger audiences. And it's also a fun element that is a major part of comic books, is that these characters, these shows, these entities don't live in isolation. In the comics, these characters are constantly running into somebody, some point, somewhere. Thanks for listening to this week's edition of the Mutant Blitz Podcast. If you like the topics that we got into today, why don't you drop a comment in the section below. If you like this podcast, hit the like button and subscribe each and every week as we bring you my perspective on the topics in the sports world as well as the comic book, television, and movie universe. I'm Josh Hennig, your host of the Mutant Blitz Podcast. Catch you next week.